Ambassador Dimitrius, Ambassador Naur, Ambassador Maliki, and Mr. Abhinav Pandya to kindly join us on the stage.
भूपेंद्र जी, मैडम को थोड़ा
I would now like to welcome Mr. Arun Anand to deliver his opening remarks. Mr. Arun Anand is a journalist based in New Delhi. He has worked in editorial positions in leading dailies and broadcasts including The Statesman, Dainik Jagran, Midday, IANS and TV Today. Mr. Anand has been tracking the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, and is the author of the book Know About RSS. He has also translated 4 books from English to Hindi, including Barack Obama's Audacity of Hope.
I'll keep the remarks very short because yesterday we had a very extended session. We had overshot the time. I think what is important in present day circumstances, as we talk about India's position in the emerging global order, there are a couple of things which I want to point out. I think probably the panelists today can talk about it, or it will set the context. One is that all of us know, that there is a battle of narratives which is going on. It is now basically the battle of narratives which is to a large extent influencing the position of countries in the global order. Second is, but as we go into this battle of narratives, India is often misunderstood. And I think India is often misunderstood because there are certain finer nuances which the West especially has to understand about India. I'll just point out a couple of finer nuances that and why India is misunderstood in this context. See, one is that nation or nationalism is not a very positive word, especially in the especially in Europe, especially in the post Second World War scenario. In India, nation is a cultural concept. In the West, nation state is a geographical context. So as Madam Puri was also talking about yesterday, when we talk about civilizational values of India, then these are inherent in the concept of nation. So we have to understand this difference, this finer difference between the nation and the nation state. So we are proud of India as a nation, whereas as I said, and the concept of nationalism we talk about is more focused, is less focused on, or rather not at all focused on, the geographical expansion as the Chinese do, but it's more about, being proud of certain eternal values, certain eternal civilizational values, the core of which is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The second is that, and especially we see a lot of this narrative in the Western media. See, there is a difference between religion and dharma. India believes in dharma. Dharma is, if I put it very simply, dharma is basically a way of life, whereas religion is a way of worship. So India's core value is Sanatan Dharma, which again means basically, there are certain eternal core values. Again, the core of that is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Whereas in the West, in the past, and why dharma is important to India, or why dharma is important to Indians? Because dharma has always guided the state in India. It has never kind of interfered in the state and what we call in Sanskrit or in Hindi the Raj Dharma. So that has always been there. And now we can say, Raj Dharma or Rashtra Dharma. So that has always guided us. That has been a very positive concept. Whereas in West, what happened? Religion, as we all know that in the medieval era, the church interfered so much in the affairs of the state that the concept of secular state emerged. So this concept of secular state does not apply to us because India was always secular because of this Raj Dharma. So these are some of the finer nuances, I think, which if we understand about India and if we are able to explain to the rest of the world, there are a lot of misgivings about the rise of India as a power, especially in the present regime, because a lot of people say it's a Hindu nationalist government or it's a Hindu nationalist movement or India is emerging as a Hindu Rashtra. So even if I want to take this question head on, the concept of Hindu Rashtra, the Supreme Court of India has also said that Hindu is a dharma. It's a way of life. You don't want to call it Hindu, you want to call it Sanatan, you want to call it Bharati, it's fine. So even the emergence of Hindu Rashtra is not contrarian to the concept of the secular state. So these are the things. As we go ahead, I think we are going to discuss more and more about it, and I leave it open to the panelists. And I'm especially thankful to Abhinav for inviting me here and being in the august company of such illustrious guests. Thank you very much.
We'll now proceed towards the first session, and the first session is about India's G20 Presidency and its expanding role in multilateral institutions. The session chair is Ambassador Lakshmi Puri. Ambassador Lakshmi Puri was the former Assistant Secretary General of the UN, the Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, the Director and Acting Deputy Secretary General, the UNCTAD Indian Foreign Service Officer, and the former Ambassador of India to Hungary, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Throughout her career, she has focused on women's empowerment and rights and led the implementation of UN-wide accountability for gender equality. After joining the UN Women's Senior Leadership Team in 2011, she positioned the organization as a key player on the global stage and helped its involvement with the Rio Plus 20 conference and Commission on the Status of Women. I'd also now like to invite the esteemed panelists to the guest. Our first panelist is Dr. Sumit Seth. Dr. Sumit Seth is a career diplomat, member of the prestigious Indian Foreign Service. He is currently heading the Foreign Policy Planning PPNR Division at the Ministry of External Affairs. Earlier, he served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Yangon, Myanmar. He was also posted at India's missions in Madrid, Bogota, and the UN Geneva. He has advanced level diploma in Spanish and has attended academic programs in international relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and Elliott School of International Affairs. His areas of interest are neighborhood diplomacy, health diplomacy, Indo-Pacific and foreign policy planning, digital diplomacy and international relations. Before joining his diplomatic career, he's worked as a medical doctor and specialized in forensic medicine and medical jurisprudence. He's also the author of a book for medical graduates in India. It's called Review of Forensic Medicine. I would now like to welcome our next panelist, Cleo Paskal, who's a senior fellow at the Foundation of Defense of Democracies. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Ravi Solanki, who's a retired UN diplomat. Over to you now.
Order, but it's also about how the world is looking at India. And this is particularly because India has taken its G20 presidency with the kind of commitment and seriousness, energy, enthusiasm which certainly I have not seen in any other G20 presidency. And also we are looking at a world, as I said yesterday, which is in polycrisis. And I have had the occasion of writing about G20 and saying that India's once in a 20-year presidency is characterized by the paradox of what Charles Dickens said in the opening lines of his Tale of Two Cities. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. It is the pinnacle of hope and it is the depth of despair. So it is at such a time that there is also, that the world is starved for positive transformation. And there is tremendous churning happening in the world order, which we have also talked about, the Cold War, the tectonic shifts, the Cold War 2.0. So in that context, how is India going to position itself, contribute to humanity's projects? And I've always talked about the 4 projects of humanity: peace and security, humanitarian and disaster response and crisis response, SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, environmental protection, climate change action, and human rights and democracy. And India is the world's oldest and largest democracy. So in a way, it is the world's best hope of the triumph of the liberal order, if you will, if the West would properly recognize it and support it. So this is the context, and we have a very distinguished panel. First of all, I will ask Dr. Sumit Seth, what is India thinking? What is the basis of its foreign policy at this point of time? And what is the vision going forward with or beyond G20 presidency?
Thank you so much, Mr. President, for giving me the floor, and very good morning to all of you. And before I actually go into, talking about some of the foundational principles on which India's foreign policy is based, I thought I'll demonstrate something. I don't know how many of you actually know the origin of word diplomacy. We have a Greek ambassador sitting here. In fact, the word diplomacy comes from a ancient Greek word called diploma, which and I need to demonstrate it to you so that you remember it. And it means folding the paper into two, and I'll show it to you. So when you fold a paper into two like this actually is the original symbolism of diplomacy. Folding a paper into two. Thank you so much for holding it. But people will say, what is the link between a folded paper and diplomacy? You might be intrigued. But in ancient times, the king used to appoint an envoy, a royal messenger, an ambassador, a diplomat, with a piece of paper and used to write a message on it. And this folded paper actually is a symbol of secure communication. The job of this diplomat was to take the message from his king or her king to another king in such a way that this message did not get distorted. This is the foundational principle on which diplomacy is based. People keep asking what diplomat do. Yesterday, I alluded to that. The 3 primary functions of a diplomat. The first one is representation. You represent your flag, your country. Second is negotiation, which means you negotiate for your national interests. But the third, perhaps, is becoming increasingly important today is communication. Because today, it's not the shortage of information, it is the plethora, it's the information overload with which diplomats have to grapple and has to sift, the chaff from the wheat so that the political leadership can take the correct decision. So that is the context I thought I'll say. Coming to India's foreign policy. there is a Nobel laureate called Richard Feynman. Some of you have read about him. Richard Feynman said that if you cannot explain a concept to a 12-year-old kid, you have not understood it well enough. So my son, who is actually incidentally is 12, 13 years, he asked me, Papa, what is India's foreign policy? What are the key principles of it? It really, because I have read books and I've attended various courses and so on, though I am a medical doctor, but I have studied probably more books on international relations by now. I said, yes, how do I explain it to him? So there are 5 pillars. If you understand this framework of 5 pillars, these mental models, and then when you read any article about India's foreign policy, or you have to speak on India's foreign policy, or to write something, you will be able to, place it in that, the mental hook cycle. The first pillar is called fountainhead of India's foreign policy. The glacier through which India's thinking about foreign policy originated. And yesterday somebody actually mentioned about Maharana. I want to add another classical text called Arthashastra. And sometimes it's really amusing, when I went to Fletcher School, I saw that Fletcher School probably teaches Arthashastra in more details and many other foreign universities than some of our own international relations, because they understand the depth. There is a concept called any idea which crosses the, or passes the test of time becomes a great idea. What is written in Arthashastra, for example, the Raj Mandala theory, or something which is called as Sam, Dam, Bhed and Dand. This is actually the correct sequence is Bhed comes before Dand. So there is spectrum. Sama means conciliation, diplomacy, negotiation, finding a common ground. Dana means, or Dama means gift, creating goodwill, building, relationship, developing trust. Bheda is a little more complicated science, that you actually create division in your enemies, if your enemy is powerful enough. And if all of this is not working, then we reach to a stage called Danda, where is economic sanctions, and ultimately war is at the extreme end of that spectrum. And this idea has passed the test of time. That's why it is even relevant today. So Arthashastra is one of those, founding. Another founding, the fountainhead of India's thinking is, the approach is called taking the middle path approach. India does not take extreme strategic positions. India is actually known today in the world as a force for moderation. Some people actually misunderstand it when we abstain from various resolutions in UN. It is important to understand that silence is also a form of expression. Resolutions are important, but resolutions are not going to end wars. That would happen in a closed door, quiet diplomacy, where you do not embarrass your interlocutor in front of audience. This is actually the core principle. Diplomacy is about candor, but candor inside a closed door setting, not in front of cameras, not in front of media. That's why sometimes media makes a mistake, because what they listen through press briefs, through joint communication, is only a tip of the iceberg. The real diplomacy happens inside the room. So that's the fountainhead. It is important to understand what does Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam actually means. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is actually also the motto of our G20 Presidency. One earth, one family, one future. That's where the core principle is. The second pillar, so first is fountainhead. The second pillar is the focus. What is India's focus in a multipolar world? How do you engage with all the poles? We have something called neighborhood first policy. We have Act East policy. There is something called Think West. We are increasingly engaging our countries in West Asia, in Gulf, because there's huge, ever increasingly strong Indian diaspora there. And these countries have also started, understanding the strength of Indian value system and so on, and also the big market which India provides. So there is an angle to that. India's approach to Indo-Pacific, how we are engaging Quad countries. So this is security and growth for all in the region. So these are the focus areas of India's foreign policy. The third pillar, in fact this is, according to me, is the strongest pillar, is India's foreign policy is a force multiplier for the government. Life of people in India, then it doesn't serve its purpose. In fact, foreign policy is no longer foreign. It is as much a part of India's domestic policy. We believe in diplomacy for development. Whether it is Make in India, whether it is Digital India, Skill India, smart cities, these domestic flagship programs will not be successful unless until we have collaboration with foreign countries on this, and where Indian diplomacy plays an important role. And pandemic proved that. When pandemic set in, all our missions and posts, our diplomats abroad, when we had shortage of medical equipment, liquid oxygen and so on, we worked on that. And we were able to tide over that difficult period. But when we were able to produce our own vaccines, our missions and our posts, our diplomats went abroad through Vaccine Maitri and so on, we were able to provide this. So that's the force multiplier impact. So all Indian missions and Indian posts, our consulates and embassies and high commissions, they are the global arm of Indian government, which increases. In fact, it is said, the sun never sets on Ministry of External Affairs. Because if in India it's night, somebody somewhere, the Indian embassies are waking up. That's the third pillar which I want to do. But we just do not focus on the domestic aspect of well-being of people. Indian foreign policy is also the force for global good. Whether we are today have established ourselves as a reputation of the first responders, HLDR operations, Vaccine Maitri has proven many countries actually were able to only initiate their vaccine program because India was able to provide this vaccines to them. We have, so this is force for global good. Creating digital public goods is another focus, whether Aadhaar, Jan Dhan accounts, mobile, UPI payments, these are digital public goods which we are willing to share this experience with our friends, partners all over the world. That's the fourth pillar. And the last, we do not just focus on the present issues. As Ma'am was mentioning about the poly crisis, Burma crisis we are facing, we are also looking at futuristic. So India's foreign policy is based on the fifth pillar called futuristic challenges. Maritime diplomacy, climate change, information warfare, cyber diplomacy, lawfare. These are the new emerging areas of, in fact, in Ministry of External Affairs, we have created a division called New and Emerging Strategic Technologies. Increased focus on cyber diplomacy, information warfare, health diplomacy. These are the newer emerging areas of this. So these are the 5 pillars. I just quickly want to recap. Fountainhead of India's foreign policy. Focus, force multiplier, force for global good, and futuristic. India's foreign policy is futuristic. I will stop here, ma'am. I think I thought I'd give you at least I was able to explain to my 12-year-old kid, so I don't know whether I
No, that was a wonderful evocation of the very structured and yet visionary way in which India's foreign policy has now been put together, both as an inspiration but also as a plan of action. So thank you so much for giving us that insight, and I would now ask our next panelist, Cleo Paskal, to please tell us how she looks at India's G20 presidency and India's engagements not only with the multilateral system, which is the UN system, with multilateralism, which is anchored in the UN system, and the Bretton Woods institutions and the WTO, but also, more importantly, this new trend which India has very much also started but also embraced of minilateralism, plurilateralism, and at the sub-regional, regional, inter-regional levels. And how do you, as a distinguished American scholar, who looks at India from also the American lens, strategic lens, how do you see India?
Thank you very much, Excellency, co-panelists, Usanas Foundation. I'm clearly out of my league, so I'm very privileged and honored to be on here. And because I'm so nervous about this, I actually put together a presentation. I don't know whether it's queued up or not. Well, here we go. Okay, so I might go over there so I can see it. So I've redone this presentation half a dozen times since yesterday because of everything I've learned in the last few days, and especially after a discussion we had last night, Ambassador. There's nothing I can say, and I'm a Canadian. I work at a U.S. think tank. No, it's okay. We're the 51st state. We know it. Indian diplomacy is bold and complex, and the solutions you're providing are beyond. I can't come and say anything. So all I can say is some of the problems that I'm seeing, and what some of the peoples in the regions where I'm working are saying they think India could really help. And I'm going to go into the maritime domain, and especially the Pacific, which is the old stomping grounds of India, right? So I mean, there's a kind of the idea of India being a continental civilization is of course completely fallacious. And you see Bali, you see the Buddhism spread all this sort of stuff, all went along the maritime routes. And the question is, can India redevent or rediscover multilateralism and go from non-alignment, which is really much was reactive, to realignment, to reshaping those sorts of institutions. Where's my buttons? This one. Okay. So, oops, go back. Right. So, yeah, there we go. So I'm going to look at the Pacific Islands. And one of the first visits by Prime Minister Modi when he was elected, in 2014, he went to the Pacific Islands. This was a real beacon of hope for a lot of countries in the region. And he showed in the policies that he announced that he really understood the concerns of the region. One of the things that had been constraining their economic development and access to education and health was visa restrictions. A lot of the flights went through Australia and New Zealand, and the Australian and New Zealand high commissions very much controlled who got in and out of the country and used it as for political leverage. And this was a real sign of trust. Just announcing visa on arrivals for the 14 Pacific Island countries said in a very real way, you are welcome. About two or 3 days later, Xi Jinping met with the Pacific Island leaders and announced a strategic partnership, which they have been working on very assiduously ever since. The Chinese engagement follows very much what you were describing in terms of the Arthashastra, where they're working from moving from goodwill to support to dependency, and they're using the exact same mechanisms that you were talking about in a really focused way. I won't go through all of this, but I will go through one element of it, which is they present commercially, we're here to do business, we're here to help your economic development. That's always tied to a strategic intent. So we'll help you build your port. Your port just happens to be long enough to take a Chinese aircraft carrier. The third element of it, which is everywhere, is corruption and criminal activity. The Chinese organized crime gangs that are operating throughout the region, the importation of drugs, prostitution, human trafficking. Very corrosive for the society. And that's actually the weakest point for the Chinese, because you go after that and the other two start to fall apart. They're gaining their influence through that corruption. We'll get back to that later. Why are they doing it? So this is, the first island chain, we talk about a lot, the second island chain. This is from the PLA handbook from 2012. They know if they're going to take Taiwan, to get the PLA, out of the basin of the South China Sea. They need to break the first island chain. That's what Taiwan is about, really. And if they take Taiwan, to hold Taiwan, they need the Pacific Islands, because your security perimeter starts in Taiwan and then goes out from there. So you need to be able to push the US basically back to Hawaii. You need to be able to make it, to contain or constrain the Japanese. You need to be able to cut off Australia and New Zealand. So the Pacific Islands are incredibly important for phase one of Chinese strategic expansion in a very real way, and that means the Pacific Islands. When Wang Yi, Chinese foreign minister, went through the region in May, June of last year, this was still during COVID. So these countries had to waive their COVID restrictions for him and his entourage to fly in. These are the exclusive economic zones of the countries he visited. They are basically making their own island chain off the coast of Australia and New Zealand. And because of the way that they use the maritime militia and the fishing fleet as dual use, including dropping buoys and mapping the underground cables, all that sort of stuff, that is actually an extremely effective way of doing it. If they're putting in fish processing station in a place like PNG, we don't quite know the full range of capacity that it would have, but it could make life very difficult for Australia and New Zealand to come up and take Taiwan. If you notice, there's Timor-Leste right in there as well. This arc creates a situation, if it becomes real, where everything east of the Malacca Strait becomes very difficult to operate in. When Wang Yi went through the region, he proposed a vision for the region that was supported by a 5-year plan. These are the elements of that vision and that region. Just some highlights. He was talking about immediate and high-level police training, cooperation on network governance, shared future in cyberspace, free trade areas, cooperation in customs inspections and quarantine, a more friendly policy environment, setting up Confucius Institutes, training diplomats, pre-positioning, emergency supplies, which won't just be emergency supplies. The action plan included a Chinese government special envoy for Pacific Island country affairs. That's now been announced. A China-Pacific Islands ministerial dialogue on law enforcement. That's already been done. Assistance in laboratory construction for forensics. Encouragement of air routes. Medical personnel, government scholarships. This is a blueprint for colonization. The thing about them is, you don't need to capture a whole country. We saw it, I'm going to go through a case study here again later. You just need to capture maybe a dozen people initially, and then they spread it throughout the system. The result is already being seen. I write a lot for the Sunday Guardian, so we broke this story. Currently, the U.S. naval ships are blocked from entry into Solomon Islands, and a U.S. Coast Guard cutter on a fisheries patrol was recently turned away from Vanuatu. Now, what do? They just didn't pick up the phone when the U.S. called. And then they blame it on their own incompetence. And there was a hearing last night. I was up until 3 in the morning watching this House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing, because the Coast Guard was testifying, and we sort of knew what one of the questions would be, which was about this question. The Congresswoman Radwagen asked the Coast Guard, we've been blocked from Solomons and Vanuatu. Has the State Department objected? And the Coast Guard woman answered, we haven't objected, and Solomon Islands was, I think, a clerical error.
Sorry?
Solomon Islands was a clerical error. Now, it is official Solomon Islands government. I can show you the press releases from the Solomon Islands government saying no naval port visits. India also can't land in Solomon Islands now. Australia and New Zealand, we can talk about Australia and New Zealand another time. Australia and New Zealand can, but nobody else can, China obviously. So I was talking to somebody at 3 in the morning about this, and they said they just waved the white flag. So, this region has been at the center of this sort of geopolitical contest for a long time. Don't underestimate the intelligence and skill of the leadership of the region. This is Samoa, a representation of Samoa being fought over by Germany, France, and the United States over 120 years ago. The leaders of today are the descendants of the leaders of yesterday. The King of Tonga is the great-grandson of the King of who negotiated with the British, they know geopolitics. And when President David Panuelo of the Federated States of Micronesia saw that Chinese proposal, he put out a letter that said, this is the single most game-changing proposed agreement in the Pacific in any of our lifetimes. What we are seeing is an attempt to shift those of us with diplomatic recognition to China very close to Beijing's orbit, intrinsically tying the whole of our economies and societies to them. To be clear, he said, the long-term goal is to take Taiwan peacefully if possible through war if necessary, and he knows the Pacific Islands are essential for that. They know what they're seeing. And I'd like to talk very quickly about one location. If I use the term freely associated states, who knows what I mean? Okay. And completely understandable. This is a unique diplomatic relationship between the United States and 3 countries, Palau, Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. It is an enormous geographic area. Combined with the Marianas and Guam, which are part of the United States, it covers as much of the Pacific Ocean as the continental United States. It is an enormous strategic area, and it gives the U.S. Responsibilities for their defense and security and right of strategic denial. This is the secret of the Central Pacific. The history of the zone, and this again gets to how sophisticated these people are. They were Spanish, and then they were independent, and then suddenly the Spanish came along and said they were Spanish, much to their surprise. And then the Germans came along and said they were Germans, much to their surprise. And then the Germans lost a war that they had never heard of, and so they became Japanese. So the Japanese were there from under the League of Nations from 1921 through the war. So you can see the Japanese mandate there. It's kind of between the Philippines. And they set up Japanese language schools. They were part of Japan. And the older people in this region speak Japanese. They learned it from their parents. Then came World War II, and they became the sites of some of the most vicious battles, kind of heart-rending battles. The level of destruction is kind of inconceivable. This is Kwajalein. If you know any military base there, it's probably the US missile base in Kwajalein. That island was destroyed. Thousands died. I was in Peleliu recently in Palau. The Japanese are still sending teams to pull bodies out to bring them back to Japan for commemoration. After the war, they became part of the UN Strategic Trust Territories. This is the only strategic territories. And again, huge zone. And of course, what the US did, if you've heard of them, was blow up a bunch of nuclear weapons there. In the Marshall Islands, they detonated 67 nuclear weapons, greatly affecting the population to today. They all became independent countries, but they have this compact of free association. They became these freely associated states, in which they can work in the US. They can go to the US, work in the US, they serve in the US military. They're so close to the US, they actually have US postal codes. It's considered domestic mail, but they are independent countries. But it underpins the entire US defense posture in Asia. It moves the front line off of Asia rather than Hawaii. This is what it looks like if you combine the exclusive economic zones, the freely associated states, and the US territories. It goes from Hawaii all the way across. This is the zone of operation of the core of operation of Indo-Pacific, of US Indo-Pacific. What does it mean? It means the Chinese aren't very happy with the COFA states, with the freely associated states, and they're trying to undermine them any way they can. In 2008, Admiral Keating told the Senate Armed Services Committee that a senior Chinese officer suggested to him, as we develop our aircraft carriers, why don't we reach an agreement? You take Hawaii East, we'll take Hawaii West, we'll share information, save you all the trouble of deploying your naval forces west of Hawaii. And if you look at the naval buildup in the last 20 years that the Chinese have done, they are trying to put themselves in a position to be able to do it. President Panuelo wrote another letter on the 9th of March. Anybody who's interested in China, I highly recommend you read this letter. Who's read this letter? It is the most detailed description of Chinese political warfare and gray zone activity written by a head of state ever. He names the Chinese diplomats who have threatened him, who've bullied his country. I'm happy to send it to anybody, make it publicly available. He refused a Chinese ambassador that they tried to send in because he knew he was part of the Chinese intelligence service, and now he knows they're just waiting for him to get out of power. And he said, to be clear, I've had direct threats against my personal safety from PRC officials acting in a professional capacity. He described a situation where he didn't want to send an FSM official to a meeting, and so the Chinese selected an FSM citizen to represent the government on the behalf of the government. China has established a precedent of taking our private citizens in multilateral meetings to formally represent our country. Their government's awareness or approval. And he also says they've been funding separatist movements in his country. Okay. And one of the areas where that happens, the governor confirmed it. I'm going through this quickly because we don't have a lot of time. The result is, what has he said? He said, please, Taiwan, let's set up diplomatic relations. So we keep hearing about countries flipping from Taiwan to China. This is the president of a country begging Taiwan to open up diplomatic relations with them. And he says very clearly, because it provides added layers of security protection that comes with the country distancing itself from the PRC, which has demonstrated a keen capacity to undermine our sovereignty, reject our values, and use our elected and senior officials for their purposes. Has anybody heard about this? That gives you an indication of how seriously the West is, about protecting countries like FSM from PRC political warfare. It's not happening. So this is why I'm personally extremely excited that Prime Minister Modi is heading to Papua New Guinea. They need another option. The West has not been protecting them from this sort of gray zone and the sort of thing that India knows extremely well and has been experiencing for a long time. They need that sort of leadership. Ambassador Puri talked yesterday about the 3 F's for the body, food, fuel, and fertilizer. What they need is the 3 F's for the soul. What they believe in is faith, family, and freedom, which are all things that are antithetical to the Chinese Communist Party. So, for the world to be one family, first of all, you have to believe in family. We're in a battle of systems, right? And the PRC typifies a system that looks for and builds on the worst in humanity. And the key end state is fear. They govern through fear. India typifies a system that looks for and builds on the best in humanity, where the key end state is often hope, hope for a better future. These are fundamentally different states of humanity. So just as the PRC's approach is a whole system, so must be the other. But don't worry, this isn't the MEA's fatal line. This has to, you need the direct flights, you need the person-to-person contact, all that sort of stuff. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. But as you said, it's also about the future, the next frontier of the world's economy and humanity's survival. The ocean governance part of it, and also what China is up to and what are the calculations. And we hope that, as you rightly said, it should not be only China, India, but that India works with other countries like the US and Australia and New Zealand to establish its own links and provide the kind of support without, as you said, dependency. I like that those terms that you used. Help and then leading to dependency. Whereas it should be about interdependence and in the spirit of one future and one family. So now, Ravi, I come to you. Our next expert, Ravi Solanki, has had a very distinguished 27 years career in the UN and particularly working on humanitarian side. But that gives you an insight into multilateral world, how it is run, what it has done, but also how flawed it is and what needs to be done to reform it. That's one part. But how has India navigated that space? And how do you look at all of that in the context of the G20 presidency?
We don't have a presentation, but still, Ambassador Puri, co-panelists, and ladies and gentlemen here. It's a rare privilege and honor that It's a rare privilege and honor for me to be here. Thank you to Usanas Foundation for having invited me here. First of all, let me rightly said, 27 years with the United Nations, practically all over, having worked with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So, being mostly on the humanitarian side, I have seen things from very close quarters. And to compliment my co-panelist Cleo Paskal on the growing influence, let me first just touch upon the Chinese influence in the United Nations of late. You are all aware of the 2015 declaration of the Sustainable Development Goals, which runs up to 2030. There are 17 of them, very, very laudable goals. Some of the other, the Chinese have been able to, shall I say, bring in their Belt and Road Initiative into this Sustainable Development Goals, and the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has unconditionally endorsed the Chinese position. Now we all know that the Belt and Road Initiative is what China does. It has done to various countries. We've seen Pakistan, we've seen Maldives, we've seen Sri Lanka, we've seen Laos, we've seen Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. In fact, Tajikistan has 60% of its foreign debt to China today, and this is slowly eroding into the UN system. We have a very developmental unit called the Developmental for Economic and Social Affairs. Now, since 2007, there have been 4 Under-Secretary Generals, all Chinese, one after the other, unprecedented in the UN system as such. So these are some things which are really glaring, and we are completely sort of surprised with this, but this is going on. Now, as we all know, 2021 was the presidency held by Italy, then it was handed over to Indonesia. And it is an amazing coincidence that the next 4 years, with India now, next year to South Africa, and then to Brazil in 2025, 4 years will be the presidency of G20 with the Global South. Now this is a great opportunity for India to redraft the role and leadership of the multilateral institutions, strengthen them, bring them in line with the current world order, so that peace can be enforced and development can be achieved. Much of this has already been said by the other co-panelists and also Ambassador Puri. I don't want to take much of the time, as this is basically, I would like to just stress that we have a golden opportunity, and India has been seen as a reliable global partner, and also seen as a democratic counterweight to China, which is something that we need to look into. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Of the Global South, and how is it positioning itself in the UN system, in the multilateral system, is a very important one from the perspective of also how, and I've been asked that question, and I'm glad you're mentioning how China's, the anachronism and in some ways inconsistency of having a UN, a multilateral system endorsing a bilateral transactional rather than a developmental initiative is something that really needs to be looked into. But again, I think the rest of the world is failing these developing countries. I was talking to Dr. Paskal yesterday, and I said that the US, that the Western countries, the European Union, the other countries have to come forward and also support the South. Otherwise, the vacuum that has been created, both in terms of concessional financing going down considerably, I mean, it has gone down, ODA has gone down 21%. Philanthropic contributions have gone down 35%. There has been, the developing countries have been struggling in so many ways, and then there is this triple crisis. I mean, even before the triple F crisis, there has been, due to the Russia-Ukraine, there has been the COVID crisis impact on developing countries, and the multilateral system did not come up. You know, you had a situation where SDRs were $655 billion, SDRs were issued, and the developing countries got a puny amount of something like 35 billion between 31 developing and 25 LDC countries. And the rest went to the developed countries, and the developed countries did not even use it. And it was not reallocated. So there are these, so we need to have a stronger multilateral system which is independent, which doesn't get institutionally captured by the big powers. And also that balance has to be there, checks and balances have to be there. The secretariat has to be made more accountable and transparent. And overall, also one of the things, as someone who's been in the UN for 15 years and who deeply believes in the core humanities projects that the UN is in charge of convening, of really, delivering the global public goods, identifying the global public goods, and delivering them, convening around them, driving international cooperation in an impartial way, and in a technically, world-class standard, that one must have technically. So that is the UN's strong suit, and that is the mission. But, we need to get there in terms of the reform. Just quickly to come back to who is the voice of the global South right now. Let us be very clear, China has, shall we say, graduated into the North. We used to, former Commerce Secretary Tejinder Khannaji is here. So I would like to recall how we used to talk about the core and periphery theory of developing countries moving from the periphery to the core. And China today has, in a way, become the North. So it can no longer claim, and it is acting very much in the colonial mode, as was illustrated by Dr. Paskal. So India, it's a rising power. It has set itself a developed goal target by 2047. So India is very much the voice of the global South. Of course, the DNA from G77 is still there, and China was never part of G77. It was always G77 and China. So we have that empathy and that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam ethos to really be the voice of the South, global South. And also, as has been pointed out by Dr. Sumit Seth, that we are actually setting the kind of role model programs and missions in India that are then available as global public goods for the benefit of the global South. And we are also advocating. And so this G20 presidency is very much about, as the priorities of India have, the 6 priorities of India have indicated: accelerated economic growth, SDGs financing, because SDGs now we are lagging behind, the world is lagging behind, And unless, and we are at the midterm point, and unless there is more financing, there will not be, we will not be, as was mentioned by you, Ravi, the 2030 target will not be reached. And that would be a challenge. The other aspect which we are very much advocating for is, from the Global South's perspective as well, is of course the life movement about sustainable consumption and production, which Prime Minister has launched, but also the green development. How do you support the Global South's transition to a decarbonized, but of course SDG rich and SDG achieving destination, because you cannot have that trade-off for developing countries. They need to have the economic growth. They need to have the gaps, the deficits in various economic goods that they lack at present. So that has to be bridged. And therefore, this very important emphasis on climate finance and technology. So they hope that in this G20, this will be given a big push. And then, of course, there is this whole issue of how does the multilateral system become fit for 21st century and fit for purpose for delivering the global goods. And then the whole reform issue comes into view. So these are some of the things, and then women-led development, what they have done, and then technological and digital public goods that and platforms that India has developed and what was mentioned. So this is the whole breadth. But let me quickly ask for all of your, concluding points, and then we give. Do we have time for two questions? Okay, so please, Raksha.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think there's a lot of discussion on China and how it's doing its own, increasing its footprints, increasing dependency. Being a serving, foreign service officer, I need to be a little more diplomatic, and so people keep asking us that what is India's game plan, what is India's model of development, cooperation, and so on. So I once responded somewhere, and this resonated with the crowd, so I am repeating it. Since we're talking about game plan, there are two kinds of toys in homes you will find with which kids play. One of them is called Jenga. I don't know how many of you know what is Jenga. This is a toy in which you stack pieces, blocks together one after another, and the game begins after that, which means you start pulling one block after another till everything collapses. That is called Jenga. So I must tell you, India is not playing Jenga. India is playing another game called Lego, which is building blocks. We put together building blocks, rearrange them. We have created digital public goods. We have created things like telemedicine, tele-education. We are building center of excellence in various countries, and it is a slow process. We also believe that there cannot be instant success with such a long-lasting impact on the lives of people in the global south. So it's a slow process. So sometimes some people who are in this Insta world wants Insta results. Those people get impatient, and they write the India's development cooperation is not working. It is not like this. Sometimes the result of the efforts come after many years. So it's a persistence, slow game. You have to work diligently. When I speak, some of my fellow diplomats, Indian Foreign Service officers, are working all over the world to ensure that the success of India's development program, which is outcome-oriented, demand-driven, it is based on social and environment impact assessment. It is based on their need, not we do not push. It is a pull mechanism. They ask for it. So, and only then we go for it. And and we follow proper tendering procedure, which takes time. Due diligence is done. So deliberative process is inherently slow. So that's where I would like to, rest my case.
Thank you. So now I have to rethink what I was going to say again, because of course I've just learned something new here too. Again, so on the Jenga thing is interesting because what China is doing is pulling country blocks out.
I didn't say that.
No, I'm not a diplomat, as you can tell, at all. So using that analogy, which has nothing to do with what I'm about to say, China's pulling, I would argue, the blocks out of the international system and rebuilding their own tower next to it through things like the BRI, which I personally think stands for the Bribery and Repression Initiative. Right, because what they're exporting isn't just the infrastructure; it's the CCP way of doing things, right? And so they're rebuilding off on the side. So you may end up with a position where you have no blocks left to play. One has collapsed, and the other one has been co-opted. The way to counter that, and this is what where India's strengths are glowing, is people to people. Economy to economy, education systems, what makes a democracy strong is what brings democracy into the international system. And just the way that faith, family, and freedom is antithetical to the CCP, democracy is antithetical to the CCP. That's why they try to destroy democracies around the world through subversion and information warfare and all that sort of stuff. So if you look at what they're scared of, first of all, that's probably something that's good for humanity, but also that means that's a weakness for them. And that's India's strength. That's why it's not just MEA's issue. I mean, this is what the Pacific Islands want is direct flights to India, so they can come here to university. They can come here. They'll build it themselves if those linkages are facilitated. So the Jenga analogy is, I'm going to steal it from you quite literally.
I would like to highlight one particular position of India, which is India is a member of Quad, India is also a member of BRICS, and India is also a member of SCO. This year we also chair the SCO, which is a unique opportunity for India to really strengthen and restructure the multilateral institutions. So I look forward to that, and hopefully something good will come out of it. Thank you.
Thank you. So can we have, I think, 2 questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Ambassador Trigunath, please.
And one learnt 8 new Fs in addition to 3 that are afflicting the world. 5 by Dr. Sumit Seth and 3 by Cleo Paskal. And absolutely fantastic. But since Cleo, you have spoken about the Indo-Pacific and the Pacific Islands mainly, I'm no longer a diplomat, used to be once. So I may ask this question coming from a think tank. We are talking about rule-based world order, in which United States the main anchor and the architect. We are also talking about the free and open Indo-Pacific. But what is that explains that US is not part of the UNCLOS, right? Which is supposed to have some kind of a maritime order. US is not part of the ICC either, but they've gleefully give all kinds of statements when ICC indicts President Putin. How would you reconcile this contradiction?
You're asking Canadian?
Can we take
Very well that China is the major challenge to the United States. How come US never thought of building bridges with Russia? And I recall in the presidential campaign in 2016, when President Trump was a candidate and used to talk about it when we were having coffee, he said, I want as president to reset relations with Russia. We are the 2 superpowers, nuclear superpowers. If we work together, we can actually settle a number of global geopolitical conflict, potential war zones, and we could settle it. whatever happened in Russia and Syria, we know all those stories. I'm surprised that a country with so much of think tank capacity, all kinds of think tanks, they fail to recognize the emerging challenge from China and not to build bridges with Russia. And I've read books on the deep state which made sure that a constant, you have to have an enemy to be able to send your weapon systems, you push the NATO boundaries eastward to the almost Russian border, when Russia happened to be. So I'm saying, surprising. And then America wants India to play softball and be part of their sort of alliance. What the hell? I remember when Indira Gandhi met President Reagan, and he said in the conversation, I was hearing that, and he said, why don't you think India and America should really band together to solve global issues? And she said, no. I think India can play a much better role of bridging and provide a peace option without aligning itself with one of the other superpower, and we pursued that course. But I continue to question this. Why is American foreign policy being guided by what Senator Presley described as the deep state and constantly creating America, Russia as the primary enemy that has to be dealt with militarily and destroyed? It's US capitalism, the financiers, what the hell is that? And India will never agree to sort of put Russia on the other side of the fence. We have a long-term relationship which is both emotional and it is cultural, and we cannot see Russia being put into the category of an enemy state vis-a-vis the American point of view. Either America changes, or in my view, they can forget India as a so-called strategic alliance partner to sort out the issues.
We will, I think,
bear that
respond
in mind.
to also this is very important comment. I think the lady there, and that's the last question, is it? Time-wise? Yeah? Yeah.
Ma'am, I picked up a line which you just mentioned, women-led development. So, India and we being believers of Yatra Naryastu Pujante Ramante Tatra Devta, and we are resurfacing our old beliefs like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and all. So, what are we doing about the women of a part of Southeast, like like Balochistan, Baloch being our saviors of our cultural heritage, like Hinglajgarh wali jo Mata Ji ka Shakti Peeth hai, but we do overlook their plight. I mean, those women are living in such conditions, and even UN doesn't pay attention to that. They don't have access to basic, right to live and the other facilities, the medical and other infrastructure. They don't have access to potable water and the other things. So one is that. Then second thing is about Afghanistan issue. The women and the education rights of girls are being in a mess, and also about Iran. So these three things, what are we doing about it? So that is one thing. Thank you.
So we have a very rich array of questions. I would request, please take your pick in terms of answering any of those. And in the end, I will try to also pitch in. Please, Ravi.
I don't want to skirt your question, but perhaps it would be better offline because there are a lot of interventions. Although, in Afghanistan the Taliban is there.
Yes.
And they have in fact banned all the NGOs, women workers. The UN is somehow carrying on their work, but on a very, very small scale. So, I mean, these are facts on the ground. In spite of all the advocacy and all the words that are going on, not much has been achieved.
Since 592 days, the girls are being banned from attending schools. So I mean, India being a विश्व गुरु बनेंगे हम लोग तो इधर हम क्या ऐसे अपने एकदम immediate
I think we will do a little bit of offline talking on that.
So all the questions are obviously legitimate and important. And you were in the context of incomprehensible U.S. foreign policy. You were very polite not to bring up Afghanistan. It's the U.S. is not monolithic. I was just in Palau. This issue about Micronesia and the potential recognition of Taiwan, for me, is a real touch. This is a real, are you serious about democracy and a free and open Indo-Pacific or not? Because Taiwan won't move unless the U.S. approves it. And if the U.S. approves it, wants it to happen, it will happen. I was in Palau recently. There was an Our Oceans conference there a little over a year ago. The Palau recognizes Taiwan, and the Palauans were told that if President Tsai came to the conference, Secretary Kerry would not come. And they were asked to cover over all the Taiwanese flags on the buildings that Taiwan had built there. That's state. That's certain parts of state, and there are a lot of people in state who disagree with that policy, but that was what was requested. DOD is completely different. DOD knows the importance of India, for example, or countries that recognize Taiwan. There are other sectors as well. It's as to why the U.S. policies currently in many areas are, I think, incomprehensible even to a lot of Americans. UNCLOS specifically, though, I think is more of a domestic political issue. There have been repeated requests, including from DOD, to recognize it. But I think part of it goes back to the idea that the U.S. shouldn't subject itself to any outside. We're the U.S. Why should we let anybody else tell us what to do? And that's the ISE thing as well. I think if this trajectory continues, I think the U.S. will realize it needs friends a lot more than it might realize at the moment, and some of these policies might change. That's like a incredibly the think tank that I'm with takes no foreign funding and no defense contractor funding. That is incredibly unusual in DC.
This session actually has been very useful for me as a head of policy planning. A lot of new ideas emerge. I especially liked the presentation by you. Because sometimes because of Pacific Islands for long remained out of our radar. But it was 2014 when our Prime Minister went there and we created something called FIPIC. Right? And recently we organized a virtual Voice of the Global South Summit on 12th and 13th of January. And we could see that in such a short notice, people from Pacific Islands participated and their voice has been taken, we have taken cognizance of their ideas. We will amplify the voice of the Global South. We will ensure that whichever platform, not just G20, but other platforms where India gets an opportunity to speak, it will not just speak, because the Global South's priorities are our priorities. So their voice is our voice. We believe in unity of voice, unity of purpose. And with that theme, we are working towards ensuring that the voice of the Global South receives due attention in all those forums where Global North is also present. Thank you.
Thank you. On Afghanistan, I would just like to say that when India was the chair of the Security Council in August 31st, there was a Security Council resolution that India piloted and got passed, which specifically asked the Taliban to do a number of things, among which is to protect the rights and promote the rights, human rights of women, both in terms of their educational and developmental rights, but also their participation in the governance of Afghanistan. So that resolution guides the international community and the UN. But the problem is, on the ground. And I think maybe Sumit, you can tell us about how India is engaging with Afghanistan. And then I will also like to refer to Kanda Saab's query.
This is a serious challenge to any country. How do you to deal with the situation when non-state actors become state actors. This is a real challenge for formulation of foreign policy. But we also believe in another principle, that we separate regimes from people. We have a long-standing relationship with the people of Afghanistan. That's why we continue to provide humanitarian assistance, irrespective of who is currently, because it is ultimately in long way, in a long term, long game, it is the people which matter. So our approach towards Afghanistan is people-centric, human-centric. And we are also working, ensuring that the people who are in power today also understand what is in benefit for the larger good of the society. But that is not how we are dealing with it.
Thank you.
So I just want to, I think two interesting points I would like to pick up. One is the UNCLOS that US has not joined, and I was on another panel on this whole ocean governance and blue economy. And one of the things that came through is, in fact, that the US is losing out in the competition in the field of exploiting seabed resources as well as marine resources, because it is not a member of UNCLOS, and China is, rampaging through the whole, system and making best use of the system of UNCLOS, and it is getting the seabed, International Seabed Authority to authorize certain areas for exploitation, whereas the US companies are hesitant to go and mine, because they would not be, they are afraid that they would not be legitimate. So there is this quandary, and I really hope that the US realizes that in the name of sovereignty, this is a lose-lose. And so anyway, that's just a response to what you were talking about. But I would like to, come back to Khanna Saab's question about Russia, India, US. Sumit is in a better position to answer. But yesterday I was, you were not here, but in my address I said a few things about what is actually happening, and therefore, and what have been the departures in, as I see them, I'm not government, I'm as an individual and as an observer of foreign policy and a student of foreign policy. What I see is that Prime Minister Modi's great contribution has been to change the power dynamics and India's engagement in the great power game by multi-alignment. And also that means going back and ending the decades-long hesitation about a strategic, close, multi-dimensional partnership with the US. In some ways ideological, in some ways historical, and also, as you said, some emotional, whether it was 71, they didn't stand by us, so those kind of things. But putting that aside, he has really built, I would say, something that is unprecedented. And I think there is this, the partnership of democracies is very important. And as I said earlier, it is about underpinning the international liberal democratic order, right? Now the question is that the US should be understanding, more understanding, and particularly certain parts of the narratives. We began with this question of narratives. Certain parts of the establishment now in the US tends to be judgmental and falsely so about what is the quality of Indian democracy, how is it a democracy or not, is it being undermined, etc. So I think we have to make sure that the US and India are on the same page in terms of their strategic partnership. And it is, I would beg to disagree with you. I think it is the partnership that will take us to our greatness path. But it has to be, yes, properly calibrated on both sides. Russia, our dilemma, you see, the Russia-China partnership, which is supposed to be the no-limits partnership, is going to be an issue in the longer term for us. Tomorrow, if Russia has to choose between us and China, who would they choose? That's the question. And particularly, I quite agree with you that...
I want to say, how come Russia was driven into a situation which they then eventually came into a closer embrace with China?
Absolutely.
It was a huge default. And this, I think the US simply missed a very great opportunity.
Absolutely.
And President Trump tried to do it. All his, security advisors, everybody was, left behind. Trade taps, and then you have proceedings against them. What the hell? They just got a great opportunity to do the great trend, who could have actually strengthened and counterpoised China in a very effective way. Today, they have just shot themselves in the foot. The two big powers are together, and should there be tomorrow a confrontation, which maybe the astrological charts are only predicting 10 years from now, you will know what happens.
No, absolutely, and this is a strategic mistake, absolutely.
And India, by the way, they were not prepared to listen to any counseling. And I remember from my days as Commerce Secretary in Geneva, and the person telling me, Americans don't like us because every time they come up with a proposal, India has a slightly improved proposal.
Anyway, so this has been a wonderful panel, and thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and also, dimensions that we didn't know about. I think that has been the strength of this conference. I've seen since yesterday that there are, revelations and completely different dimensions of international relations and India's place in the world order emerging from these discussions. Thank you very much, and thank you, the audience.
Mentioned Jenga. I think earlier we used to talk about the domino effect. We can now talk about the Jenga effect. I loved the way Cleo Paskal delved into details about China's influence operations in the Pacific Islands, and I don't think I've seen a more detailed presentation in the last few days, last few years. And thank you, sir, for talking about how very smartly China is able to sneak its BRI at the level of UN when it's talking about sustainability. It's a bit hypocritical because the BRI is known for flouting a lot of sustainable development goals and norms, etc. So thank you so much for your comments. I would now like to welcome Abhinav Pandya and Dr. Jain for felicitating our honorable guests, Ambassador Naur Gilon and Madam Oli Gilon. Could we please have you on stage? Yes.